Okay, so this is part two of a lecture on Aristotle's ethics, the Nicomachean ethics. So the final purpose of human life is eudaimonia, and the whole goal of ethics is to determine what is the final purpose of life and what are the conditions that bring about that. So Aristotle works his way up in book one to finally arguing that whatever else the final purpose of human life is, it has to be final and it has to be self-sufficient. By final, he doesn't mean it comes at the end of your life. He doesn't mean final chronologically. He means final in the sense of purposes. Some things are done for the sake of other things. Like if it's too hot in the house, I open the windows. So I open the windows so that would bring in fresh air to the home, so it would be cooler. But then I could ask, what is the final purpose of that? Why do I want to bring fresh air into the house? So that I can breathe better and feel better being in my own home. And then you could ask, well, why do you want to breathe better and feel better in your own home? And ultimately it will lead to a sense of well-being. So Aristotle concludes from that everything we do for the sake of some purpose, some telos. But those purposes are for the sake of some more fundamental purpose. I believe the example he uses is bridle making. In ancient Greece, they invented classical dressage and they used the horses for battle. And then they even created contests of who could train their horses the best. And they would do all kinds of fancy footworks. Ultimately, the horses start dancing around, and that developed into classical dressage. So Aristotle's asking, what are bridles for? And it's for controlling the horse. What is controlling the horse for? Well, pretty much controlling the horse had to do with prowess in battle, winning the battle. Then you could ask, well, what is winning the battle for the sake of? Well, winning the war. What is winning the war for the sake of? Achieving peace. What is achieving peace in the land for the sake of? And now we're back to well-being again. It always comes back to well-being. Either the well-being of the community, if it's political eudaimonia, or the well-being of the individual, if it's ethical. So he's working his way up. I've already told you what the final purpose of human life is for Aristotle, but right now I'm articulating the thought process that led him to that. So he realized that whatever else the final purpose of human life is, it has to be final. And by final, he means everything else is done for it, and it's not done for the sake of anything else. It's chosen for its own sake. One of the appealing aspects of the Nicomachean ethics that I like about it is there's heavy emphasis on activities that bring about inherent value, activities that are not for the sake of anything else. There's certain things we do that are not for the sake of anything else. Some things we do are for the sake of other things. So eudaimonia, or happiness, is chosen for its own sake. It's not for the sake of any. If someone were to ask, well, why do you want to be happy? Aristotle would say, well, that's an inappropriate question because it has no why. It's chosen for its own sake. So whatever is chosen for its own sake the goal is the activity itself. There's no goal outside the activity. And that's refreshing in our day to day because mostly everything we do is for the sake of something else. So life just becomes a big chore. That's doing your chores. So you do your chores so you can be done with them. But you don't engage in activities that have inherent value just to be done with those. Like playing a game. You don't play the game just to be done with it. You play the game as a pleasurable pastime. So that's what he means by final. And self-sufficient, he means you don't need anything else. If it's self-sufficient, then you don't need anything else. You have this, there's nothing lacking. You don't have this sense that there's anything missing, important missing in your life. So the only thing that meets those two criteria is eudaimonia, is well-being. So well-being is the final purpose of human life. So once he establishes that, then he sets out to think about, well, what are the conditions that bring that about, both in the individual soul and the soul writ large, namely the polis. Well, we're dealing with ethics now, so we're dealing with the human soul. And he claims that eudaimonia is an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue, with arete. So there are two kinds of arete, the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. So as we cultivate the moral virtues and as we cultivate the intellectual virtues, there accompanies that this feeling of well-being. So the road to happiness is moral virtue and intellectual excellence. So books 2, books 3, book 4, and book 5 are all about moral virtue, arte. And what he does is lays out in book 2 the general theory in outline form. And then he goes through one by one all the moral virtues. And it's an interesting read. And I don't know how many people actually take it to heart, but I can imagine somebody like taking it seriously and actually trying to bring that about in their life. You know, I wonder to what extent people take philosophy seriously. All right, so here's his theory in general about the moral virtues. We have feelings and we engage in actions, okay? So, and there are certain spheres of feelings or actions. For example, confidence and fear is one sphere, okay? Now these spheres of feelings or actions are a continuum. There's an extreme pole on one side of excess, and there's another extreme pole of deficiency. So there are two poles. Actually, the poles don't really exist in real life, but theoretically, you know, there's an infinite number of degrees in between the two poles. And the two poles are just sort of linguistic extremes. In real life, you're always somewhere in between those two poles. So that reaches down deep into our animal nature. I mean, if you can get a litter of dogs, for example, of puppies, and there'll be some that are much more bold and they'll go out and they're curious and they'll look for things. And so they have a lot of confidence. Others are very timid just by nature, and you have to sort of build their confidence. So it reaches into the whole animal kingdom, and it reaches into our animal nature too. So that's confidence and fear. So that's one sphere, one realm of feelings. Or there's another one, giving and taking. Now that's more of an action. So giving, there's an extreme of giving too, where one becomes extravagant. And then there's a deficiency of giving, which is like being stingy. So he demarcates out 12 of these spheres of feelings or actions. I only mentioned 2. We could go through them all, but there's no reason to do that. Let's take another one, one more. Let's take the pleasures of touch and taste. So there's an extreme of that. If you're self-indulgent and you engage in the pleasures of touch and taste, what are the pleasures of touch and taste? Basically eating, drinking, and sensuality, sex. So some people go to extremes in those and then become gluttons or alcoholics, or there's all kinds of words for sexual perversions and so on. Or there's a deficiency of that, insensitivity. So all these 12 spheres of feelings or actions have an extreme and they have a deficiency. Well, they're both extremes. There can be an extreme deficiency too. Usually we use the word extreme to mean too much of something, but there can be not enough of something. That's an extreme too. So excess and deficiency, just think of it that way. So now you bring in this notion of habit. this is, see, what's beautiful about realism is it's based on common sense. Only he elevates it. It's like common sense on steroids. He elevates it and roots it in some deep thinking. This is the the native wisdom of the ancient Greeks, but he raises it up and makes it into a philosophical system. So, okay, so he's demarcated out these 12 spheres of feelings or actions, and there's an extreme and there's a deficiency. Now, if you bring in the notion of habit, hexis, Hexis, hexis means habit. If you do something habitually, then that becomes your part of your character. Characteristics develop from corresponding activities. Every good parent knows this. Every good trainer animal trainer knows this. We all know it intuitively. If you do something habitually, then that's going to become part of your nature. So if you act, let's go back to the first one I mentioned about confidence and fear. If you act with an excess of confidence and you do that habitually, then you become a rash person, foolhardy. But if you act with a deficiency of confidence and you do that habitually, then given that principle, characteristics develop from corresponding activities, then you become a coward, and cowardice comes into your character. So the vices are all based on acting habitually with an excess or deficiency in your feelings and actions. Okay? So this is common sense. It's not rocket science, but it's solid. It's pretty hard to dispute that. If you act habitually with an excess in any sphere of human activity, that will become your character. So if you act with a deficiency, that would be, so the excess and the deficiencies that become characteristics, those are the vices. That's called a vice, the opposite of virtue. Okay? But now here's the key. If you act with the proper measure, and I use the word proper measure when I translate the Greek word metron, metron. That's the key word to Aristotle's whole moral theory. Metron. So most translators use the word mean, mean, but I think that's confusing because it's not an arithmetical mean. And he even goes out of his way to say that. When you're acting in life, you don't say, well, that's a 9 and this is a 2 and now I'm going to act with a 5 or something. It's not an arithmetical mean, but there is a proper measure. And it's very hard to find that proper measure. If you think about the mistakes you've made in life or the inadequacies of your own character, usually it's about going to excess or deficiency. Like when I make mistakes training my dog or even with my own self, some people are too hard on themselves. So if you go to excess or deficiency, then you've missed the proper measure. So it's like a target. You try to hit that proper measure. Now the proper measure is relative, but it's not absolutely relative. I found 3 ways in which the metron is relative. It's relative to the person because different people have different kinds of innate tendencies. Like some people are just generous by nature, so they give a lot and they feel like they haven't given very much. Or some people are very timid by nature, so they just show a little bit of courage and they think they're being really courageous. So it's relative to the person. The mean is the proper measure is also relative to the situation. Different situations determine different responses. Sometimes protest and revolution is called for. That doesn't mean, the metron doesn't mean that we just go along with things and just be cool all the time. In fact, anger is one of the spheres that he demarcates out. Maybe we should go over a few more of these, but one is anger. If you go to extreme with anger, then that's called irascibility. Some people are just angry about everything all the time. The littlest thing makes them. And then there's apathy too, where people don't care one way or the other. So anger is the proper measure of anger is a virtue, but it can't go to excess. Otherwise it becomes debilitating. So he lays this all out in outline form, and then he goes through each one by one. Like there's different kinds of anger. Like some people sulk, so they're really angry, but they don't show the anger, so that's called sulking. And he claims, this is the hardest person to be with, the sulker, because they're angry. You don't know why they're angry. So, but that comes in his more elaborate discussion of the moral virtues. But this is the key, and it's not that hard, but it's solid. So you would look for the 12 spheres of feelings or actions. Then there's an excess and a deficiency. So there'll be two vices for every virtue. The virtue is the characteristic that develops from acting with the proper measure. So if one acts with the proper measure with regard to the feelings of confidence and fear, then courage comes into your character by nature. So you don't even have to know what courage is. See the big difference between Plato and Aristotle on the moral virtues? For Plato, you have to know what courage is to be courageous. Then you're transformed by that insight into the essence of courage. For Aristotle, it's fine. He's not against knowledge. You can't say that Aristotle's anti-intellectual. He is the intellect of the West. So he's not anti-intellectual. He just says that he only says that we become courageous or just or all the moral virtues, not by knowing what they are, but by acting through our habits. Characteristics develop from corresponding activities. Puts the accent on activities. So Andrea is the Greek word for courage. That's where names like Andrea and Andrew and Andrea is courage. Andrea comes into our character when we act with the proper measure with regard to feelings of confidence and fear. And it's not that the courageous person doesn't feel fear. He or she controls the fear. But if you act with deficiency of confidence, then you become a coward. If you act with an excess, you become rash, foolhardy. If you give too much, then you're extravagant. If you don't give enough, then you're stingy. And there's one called magnificence. I like this one because you have to be rich to be magnificent for Aristotle. But magnificence just means suitable expenditure on a grand scale for the common good. What he means by that is rich people are obliged to spend that money for the common good, like keep the money circulating, don't hoard the wealth. That's why during the Renaissance, Lorenzo de' Medici was called Lorenzo the Magnificent, because they all read Aristotle, and they knew the Nicomachean Ethics was a famous book during that time. And Lorenzo would make the Uffizi Gallery or commission the statue of David and so on. And so he was called Lorenzo the Magnificent. Magnificence for Aristotle means suitable expenditure on a grand scale for the common good. So if you're rich and you hoard the money, then that's a vice. But if you spend it extravagantly and for the wrong reasons, then that's a vice also. So the virtue is always connected to the proper measure, to that balance that I mentioned. And the proper measure is also relative. So it's relative to the person, it's relative to the situation, and it's also relative with respect to the virtue itself. Like generosity is closer to giving than it is taking. Courage is closer to confidence than it is fear. Okay, so depending on what virtue you're talking about, it's not right in the center. And so he gives like a rule of thumb. Stay clear of the excess or deficiency that's more opposed to the mean, to the metron, the proper measure. So it's kind of a rule of thumb. See, in book one, he tells everyone you can't ask for more precision in ethics than the discipline can give you. But what you lose in precision, like you can be precise in mathematics, you can be more precise in physics. Even he thought you could be precise in metaphysics too, with regard to thinking about being itself. But when it comes to ethics and politics, you're in a little more murky area. But what you lose in precision, you gain in relevancy, because these are the most relevant, two relevant things, ethics and politics, for people's well-being. So what you lose in precision, you gain in relevancy. This is very important. I mean, if you don't know how to make a quadratic equation, that's not a good thing, but it's not the end of the world. But if you don't know how to live well, that's pretty important, right? So he says these things along the way. So that's why it's important to read the primary text. A lot of people think, well, let me just get the bottom line. I'll read a good secondary text. I don't need to read. But you lose all the joy of connecting with a great mind. So if you actually read the primary text, then you're transported back to ancient Greece. You're listening to Aristotle, like walking in the covered ambulatory and listening to him, because he wrote these things down. So that's the essence of, there are others. Well, let me just do one more. This one, it's called ready wit, or being witty. So it had the sphere of activity that he's talking about is pleasantness in conversation. So if you go excess with that and try to be funny, and you have bad taste, and you go to extreme, and then that's called buffoonery. It's from buffo. I know the word in Italian, it's probably close to the Latin. Buffo means clown in Italian. So if you try to be funny and you're in bad taste, that's the excess of pleasantness in conversation. But if you have a deficiency of that, that's called boorishness. You become boring. The proper measure is ready wit. He calls it wit, being witty. And then in his extended discussion, he talks at length about wit, about all these vices and virtues. So it's a fascinating read, and it could be very useful too. One could use it to actually give shape to one's character if you took it seriously. So that's the gist of it. That's the whole thing, and it's one of those headlines in the history of moral theory. The doctrine of the golden mean, it came to be called, but it's not a mean. It's the metron. I like that better. It's a better translation of. Well, I just leave it in the Greek, metron, and I translate it into English, proper measure. But what's proper? It's hard to hit that, and the reason it's hard to find the proper, the very fact that it's hard to find the proper measure makes moral virtue rare, and that's why it's a rare thing to meet people with these virtues. There's one called magnanimity, which translates megalopsychia perfectly. Magna in Latin means great. Anima, you know that word now from de anima. Magnanimity, great soul. Peripsyche means great soul in, magna psyche means, not magna, what is it? Oh, I forget the Greek word now. It doesn't matter. Anyhow, magnanimity translates perfectly from the Greek to the Latin. That's one of the, he calls that the crown of the moral virtues. In order to possess magnanimity, you have to have all the other moral virtues. So why is he discussing this moral virtues? And well, it's because cultivating the moral virtues is cultivating well-being in one's life. What is well-being? An activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. So when we're acting virtuously, automatically there's this sense of well-being that accompanies that action. So that's a very different notion of happiness that we're accustomed to. It's not being in a good mood all the time, but it's having this sense of well-being. Well, there's another kind of virtue, and this is what I want to talk about. They're the intellectual virtues, and those are rooted, remember, when we talked about the soul, the reason knowledge of the soul is important is because all the moral virtues are rooted in when deliberative reason is commanding and the sensitive part of our soul, the appetitive part of our soul, the animal soul, is obeying. When those dynamics are happening, then the moral virtues are developing. By the way, he makes a distinction between actions. I think I mentioned this, but there are actions that create moral virtue. Then there's actions that flow naturally from a virtuous disposition. And in order for it to be virtue, properly so called, it has to come from a relatively stable disposition. It can't be coerced. I didn't talk about, there's a lot more to this ethics. He has this long digression about moral responsibility, about when is someone responsible. Perhaps I should just say a few words about that before I go into the intellectual virtues. I can summarize it quickly, but there's a lot more to it. But it's a whole big digression on moral responsibility, and it found its way into our courts of law. So, what are you responsible for, and what are you not responsible for? Well, for Aristotle, you're responsible for all your actions except for those that are due to compulsion and due to ignorance. Okay, if somebody holds a gun to your head or forces you to do something, then you're not responsible for that action. That's common sense, right? If you're working at a bank and a bank robber comes and he's going to blow up everything, unless you give him the money, they're not going to charge you for robbery, right? So, or if somebody's hijacking a airplane and you're the pilot, they're not going to charge you for hijacking. So you're not responsible for any action done due to compulsion. And you're not responsible for actions due to ignorance. What he means by that is if you don't have enough information, that's why do you ever notice in courts of law, they're asking, how much did you know at that time? Or not just in courts of law, in any situation where moral judgments are being made. Did you know that this pandemic was deadly, when all the way back in March and February? Or did you know that? See, it's important how much somebody knew at a particular time. So if your action is done due to ignorance, if you didn't know, then you're not responsible. But if your action is done in ignorance, there's one little word, due to or in. In ignorance means, what it means is, let's say you get so angry, you do something and you make a crime of passion, or you say things that are stronger than you would like to have said. You feel bad afterwards. You're still responsible. If you drink too much and you do something, you're still responsible because you're acting in ignorance. Somebody could say, well, I was out of my mind. I didn't know what I was doing. But you're still responsible for Aristotle. There's none of this temporary insanity business going on. So and then due to compulsion. So you're responsible for everything except for actions done due to compulsion or due to ignorance. But if you're acting in ignorance, you're still responsible. So he really puts the responsibility on the person. It's hard if you're not living a good life, then there's something you're doing wrong. He puts the responsibility on us. Although he does make place for, like I said, good luck and fate and so on. So let's talk about the intellectual virtues, and there are 5 of them that he speaks of, and 3 of them are rooted in the contemplative part of the reason. Remember, there's the vegetative soul, which is contained within the sensitive soul, and then the vegetative and sensitive soul are contained within the rational soul. And then reason has 2 parts, the contemplative reason and deliberative reason. So the first 3 intellectual virtues are rooted in the contemplative part of the human soul. And the first one he calls episteme, and they usually translate as rational knowledge. Any body of knowledge that can be demonstrated. So not just science and mathematics, but any body of knowledge, like any body of solid knowledge that can be demonstrated That's episteme, that's knowledge. So when you're engaging in learning knowledge, there's an accompanying sense of well-being that comes with that. It's unfortunate that when you're children, if you ever watch children, they love learning, and then after a certain age, suddenly, asking to read or something is the most excruciating thing. So it might be something wrong with the education system. Emphasis too much on proficiency rather than the activity of learning through play. I use only play when I train things. So episteme is one of the intellectual virtues. So that means gaining knowledge and even generating knowledge too, doing research. Now, this one hardly anyone engages in, but it's very important. It's called noesis, Noesis. And it has to do with gaining insight into the principles upon which knowledge is based. He learns this from Plato, I'm sure, because Plato's emphasis on the ideas. These ultimate ideas are the foundations. So, like, for example, biology this is an example, right? There are so many examples, but biology is an example of episteme because it's knowledge of life. Logos, ology, that means the study of, it means a lot more than that, but one of the meanings of logos, you saw how rich the word logos was from Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics and from John, the disciple John. In the beginning was the logos, so that word is, there are volumes could be written on that. But when you see the word ology at the end of words, it means the study of something. So bio means life. So biology is the study of life. So you go to biology class or you read a biology book and you learn about life. But you don't learn about the principles upon which biology is based. If you ask, what is life? You have to close your biology book and open a book by Bergson or Nietzsche or some philosopher of life. And you begin to learn about life. Without life, there can be no study of life, right? Or anthropology, the study of anthropoi. Anthropoi means human in Greek, the study of humans. So you go to anthropology class and you learn about humans. There's all kinds of cultural anthropology, and you learn all kinds of things about humans. But if you ask, what is a human being? What is human nature? Now you move out of anthropology into the philosophy of human nature, or what came to be called philosophical anthropology. So you're asking about the principles upon which anthropology is based. Or like when I was talking about history at the beginning of this course with Vico and the 3 ages that humanity, that all the nations go through. That's not history. That's the philosophy of history. He's talking about all the stages that all nations go through in their rise, development, acme, decline, and fall, in the course and recourse. That's the philosophy of history. And in history class, you don't ask about that. You could, and sometimes historians give a quick and dirty answer. Not dirty, but just quick answer. But they don't spend 15 weeks trying to find out what is history. Otherwise, you'd never learn about the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Civil War, whatever you're studying, right? So noesis is gaining insight into the principles upon which knowledge is based. That's just another way of saying it's raising ultimate questions. And hardly anyone does this, but anyone who does do this is given this incredible boon in life. They're immediately elevated above the common way of seeing things. They're moving out of the cave, if you want to speak in Platonic language. Do what? Combine episteme with noesis. Combine your knowledge with principles upon which knowledge is based. So if you're going to become a teacher, then you learn your subject matter, you learn your courses in education, but study the philosophy of education. And I don't mean just one little course taught in the education department. I'm talking about a lifelong study, reading John Dewey, we started that a little bit with Plato, the allegory of the cave. He was talking about paideia, that's education. And as time goes by, you start combining your knowledge of education, episteme, with insight into what is education. Perhaps education has something to do with the acquisition of wisdom or the transformation of the self towards wisdom. There's no talk of that in education classes. And that one could do that with physics and metaphysics, with history and the philosophy of history, with any discipline. Political theory, if you're going to become a lawyer or studying political science, then you could study the history of political philosophy. When you combine those two, now you move into the third kind of wisdom, intellectual virtue, and that's Sophia. That's Aristotle's notion of Sophia. The combination of knowledge with the insight into the principles upon which knowledge is based. And these principles are different depending on what discipline you're talking about. Like the principles of life are different from the principles of history and so on. They're all related, but the founding principles of each of the disciplines are different. So those are the three intellectual virtues: episteme, that's knowledge, rational knowledge; then noesis, the good translation of that would be, well, the way I translate it is, I just spell it out: insight into the principles upon which knowledge is based. I think they translate it as intuitive reason. And then Sophia is nothing other than the combination of the other two. The fourth kind of intellectual virtue is called phronesis. And I've studied this carefully. There's a whole history of phronesis, and somebody needs to write the history of phronesis. In the West, it goes all the way back to Odysseus from Homer, because he's an imaginative universal that represents the practical wisdom of the Greeks during their heroic age. But by the time you get to Aristotle, it's in Plato, but with Plato, he never really distinguished between speculative wisdom and practical wisdom. Aristotle makes this distinction. Sophia is speculative wisdom for Aristotle. Phronesis is practical wisdom. So what's the difference? Well, practical wisdom has to do with making choices in life. So if you're a leader, you need to make choices. Even if you're not a leader, you have to lead yourself through life. You have to make choices. But the more responsibility you come, if you're the president, for example, then you have big choices to make. And that's why people are watching the president and what he's doing, and because his choices are affecting the whole nation and the world, in fact, sometimes, because everything is connected now in this global world. So the more political it becomes, the more responsibility. So Aristotle claims that there's political phronesis and then there's ethical phronesis. So political phronesis has to do with excellence in deliberation in making choices with regard to the well-being of the community, of the state. And ethical phronesis has to do with excellence in deliberation with regard to choices being made in the individual sphere and in relationship to your family and close friends. Phronesis is excellence in deliberation. And this is the most extended discussion of practical wisdom in ancient Greek philosophy. Other philosophers will take it up. Epicurus will, you'll see when we move into Epicurus. But Aristotle is and it's connected with politics too. But in the book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, that's the most extended discussion. And I could speak for a long time on this, but there's a lot to it, but that's the gist of it. It has to do with making the best choice that will lead to well-being. And for that, he makes a distinction between that and knowledge and Sophia. You know, he's separating things and giving precision to things. For example, the phronimos, which means the person who possesses phronesis. And politicians have to possess phronesis for Aristotle. Otherwise, they're not genuine politicians. Phronesis, the phronimos, the person who possesses phronesis, needs to have knowledge of the past, history. And they need to have ingenuity. Ingenuity is the power to see similarities and disparate things. So they can see the past, they know the past, and they can see similarities between situations that took place in the past and in this situation that they're facing now. Maybe in the situation room. That's interesting. They call it the situation room, right? Because it's happening now and we have to make choices about this situation. And they can see similarities, the phronimos can. And then they can learn from the past. They also have to see how this situation is unique too. They're not indiscriminately applying principles that they have come up with they're not indiscriminately applying procedures that they came up with at meetings, for example, and committee meetings, but they're assessing the uniqueness of this particular situation, how this situation is different from every other one. So no procedure will ever work because procedures are universal and the situation is particular. So the universal never fits the particular. So they need to have phronesis. This is very important for us today because most decisions are made on the basis of procedures today, or just complete willy-nilly because well, I don't want to get into politics too much, but they're either done willy-nilly or supporting some political agenda or on the basis of procedures. But for Aristotle, all this is inadequate. If it's done according to politics, then it's just self-interest. It's not for the common good. If it's willy-nilly, then they're just making decisions because they don't know any better, and everybody else has to just suffer the consequences. So if there's a phronimos in position and power, then that person sees the whole situation. They see where it came from, they see where it is, they see where it's going, they see precedent cases from the past, and they can choose the best course of action. And of course, they listen to others. It's not just one person making choices. They listen and they're engaging in dialogue, and then they choose. So it has to do with assessing the whole situation. So the difference between Sophia is the whole of knowledge, but phronesis has to do with seeing the whole situation. What does it mean to see the whole situation? You have to see where it's coming from, where its origin. That's why I spent so much time on the origin of philosophy with you guys, because I wanted you to see what philosophy was as a whole. If you can gain insight into the origin of something, you gain insight into its nature. The nature of something, that's why natura means to be born. All right, so that's a little bit on phronesis. I feel strongly about this topic because I think it's so much needed today. And then the last one is called techne. I mentioned that last time. It's called art or craft. And everyone knows the feeling of joy that comes with a job well done. And art, when you create something and you feel proud of what you made. There's nothing wrong with feeling proud of what you made. There's no, in fact, pride is one of the virtues for Aristotle. Actually, it's one of the virtues. But if you go to excess, then that's called vanity and so on. Right? It can't be excessive. But then pride later on becomes one of the 7 deadly sins. But for Aristotle, there's nothing wrong with, in fact, it's a virtue to feel proud about something, about a job well done, and about making things. And everyone knows about the joy that comes along with creating. In the Middle Ages, or in the Renaissance, that was a big idea, that God is a creator. So when we act creatively, we're acting in the image of God. And that's why that great joy comes over us. But that's a Renaissance idea. So those are the 5 intellectual virtues: episteme, noesis, sophia, phronesis, and techne. And accompanying all those 5 comes this feeling of well-being. And so well-being is an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. Well, these are the virtues. So if you cultivate those, you're going to get the sense of well-being. Now it's hard. I mean, if you're a general and you're landing on Normandy Beach and you make some good decisions, but you lose people, you're not in the state of joy, right? But there's still, Aristotle says, on a deeper level, There's this sense of well-being in knowing that you acted rightly. You know. All right, so those are some highlights of the moral and intellectual virtues uh, from book 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right, so that's my talk on Aristotle. We're going to move now into Epicurus. Thank you.